All right, well, this is podcast 1.2. We're going to be talking about the scientific method and filling in some definitions on page 4. And it really is just that top part of page 4. We'll start with the rest of that chemistry stuff at the bottom of page 4 in the next podcast. And just FYI, this podcast is probably going to be a little bit more like what you're going to see in the future, where exactly what you're looking to fill in your packet is popping up on the screen, and even each slide on the screen is kind of set up and organized like what you're seeing in your packet. I do have a little bit more space on my slides because of the way that I've broken it up, but not everything that I write on my screen has to go in your packet. Make sure you get those basic definitions, that you understand that overall context, but you don't have to write down every single word if you don't need them. So let's go ahead and start by defining the scientific method. This is an organized process used by science to do research. It's a very basic definition, but that's really all that it is. It can be a flexible process, and sometimes it follows kind of different procedures based on what science you're working in, but all sciences do use this process. Chemistry, biology, physics, astronomy, everywhere. And you might even use this outside of a science classroom. It's just an organized approach to solving problems. And that word organized there is really one of the most important parts of that definition. It's a systematic process. It's predictable. You need to have a way of approaching a problem where you're going to get from the problem to the answer the same way every time. Because if other scientists can't repeat your experiments and get the same results, then you're not actually going to get credit for that discovery. They're going to think that you falsified data. So you have to be able to follow this process through and be systematic about it if you want to get recognized for these things that you're doing and discovering. So, like I said, this process can be a little bit flexible, but in general, it starts with an observation. You see something happen and you go, well, I wonder why that happened. So that observation very quickly leads to a question, something that you want to know. And you might even have a prediction about what's causing that or why it's happening. And having that little bit of understanding, even just a half of a prediction in your brain about why that's happening, is going to help you design your experiment better. You have to have some idea about what's causing say plants to grow taller if you're going to design an experiment to test what affects plant growth. So you have to have a little bit of an idea there. But then you design your experiment, you get some data out of it, and hopefully that leads you to a nice clear conclusion that answers your question and explains that observation that you had. But like I've said before, science is a little bit messy, and sometimes you might get data out and it tells you that your prediction was wrong. And that might mean that you designed your experiment poorly, so you didn't get the best data. So you might have to go back and reevaluate your prediction and reassess how to design that experiment and hopefully get better data the next time, and then you can get to a conclusion. But that might even take you even farther back and make you wonder about your question, if it's even valid question or changing what you're investigating in the first place. So this does tend to take scientists in a little bit of a circular process. Research almost never gets to a nice, neat bow at the end once you get up to those high levels. But no matter what, it's still going to be an organized process. So let's look at two different types of data, because we saw that data is going to determine where we go and what we do with these experiments. And there's two different types, qualitative and quantitative. And really, you can probably tell the difference between these by bringing them back to that root word, qualities and quantities. So those qualities tend to be descriptive information, words that are describing some kind of physical characteristics, at least in chemistry. So things like color, odor, shape, etc. Things that you're going to write out words as your observations. Quantities, on the other hand, are numerical information, numbers, just telling you how much stuff you have, how big it is, how small it is. Now, if I just said big or small, that's back to being a quality. But if I say it is 3.3 meters or 10.2 grams, that is quantitative data. So the type of data that we're going to collect is going to change based on the lab. We're going to start with more qualitative labs near the beginning of the year, and as we start being able to take better measurements and do the calculations with those measurements, we'll start doing more quantitative labs later on. So the next chunk of words to define all kind of go together, and they're very similar. We've talked about having a question that's driving our experiment, and that's a hypothesis, and it's really just a temporary explanation for what's been observed. And generally, this is that starting point for further testing and experimentation. So it's important to have a hypothesis so that you can design your experiment well, but it's not really an answer. It's just a thought. A theory, on the other hand, is a tested, well-substantiated explanation for why something's been observed. So this is where other scientists come in and do their own experiments following your process. If they get the same results, then that can become a accepted theory that explains why what's happening is happening. And if enough people do those tests and everyone agrees that obviously this is the reason why or how something is happening, then that can become a law, a universally accepted explanation of how some aspect of the natural world behaves. Now, it is generally the natural world that tends to have laws associated with it because everything else is a little bit too messy and complicated in order to get well-defined laws. And there's things that break those rules as soon as we try and make them laws, and so they just go back to being kind of theories. So, just want you to understand there are different levels of kind of scientific conclusions here that aren't all quite equal. But we're not going to really be developing a lot of theories and laws in our class, not to this level at least. So this next chunk of information is really going to help you as you're designing an experiment in our lab next class. So an experiment is a set of careful changes and observations that test a specific hypothesis. So if we were testing how fertilizer affected plant growth, we would have to make sure that we choose a fertilizer and put it in the right amounts and make observations that will let us see how that fertilizer is affecting plant growth, whether it's helping or hurting it. Now, one thing that's going to be really important, especially in that plant growth experiment, and as in all experiments, is having a standard used to compare your results to in that experiment. If I'm testing whether or not this new fertilizer is going to help or hurt plant growth, I need to have a plant that doesn't have any fertilizer on it in order to compare it to. And that needs to be as close to the fertilizer plant situation as possible. So we would make sure they're in the exact same sunlight, getting the exact same amount of water. It's just that one has fertilizer and one doesn't. It's sometimes called a baseline for your experiment. We got to know what the plant does normally, and then we change those situations to see how that change affects our variable. So, like I was just saying, the function of that control is used to compare how changes affect an experiment. So now this last little section where it asks you to give 2 examples of qualitative and quantitative data is going to be left up to you. I don't care whether they're in your bedroom, the rest of your house, or someplace else. I just want you to have 2 examples for each type of data, and I want you to label those so you can create kind of a T-chart or list of qualitative and quantitative as long as you write those words along with those observations, that data that you're collecting. And there's not really a lot of vertical space, so even though this is how I did it in my packet, you might consider just putting them one word on top of the other and then listing out some qualitative and quantitative examples after them, and that'll take up a little bit less space. It's up to you. Just make sure you get 2 examples for each, and we will go over those in class next time. Hope this wasn't too bad. Have a great rest of your night.